Thank you. Let me, before I say anything, let me compliment both Sarah Stern and the rest of you for the work of EMET and all the work that you're doing to keep the cause of Israel going. And it's in a wonderful turnout, and it's great to see. Speaking as a journalist, you know, we have to live. The primary directive of a journalist is that we have to live in the real world. We have to live in the world that we're in. And while Danny Danon is absolutely right when he says that Oslo is dead, it's not really dead. Yes, it's failed, but it is with us yet, and we are still living in the world of Oslo. And one of the things that we have to take with us is to understand as important as it is to detail its failures, where it's going wrong, and how not to repeat those mistakes. We are still living in the Oslo world, and there's no escaping it. How we deal with that, therein hangs the tale of whether Israel can be successful in avoiding new disasters. As we look back over these last 20 years, understanding what has happened, you know, you can sum it up in a few words, in a headline: assumptions, myths, and lessons unlearned. We all remember, or at least some of us remember, 20 years ago when the Accords were signed on the White House lawn. And soon after that book, which you really have to hang on to, I mean, that's a collector's item.
It costs 1 cent. 1 cent on the internet.
And yet it's rare. And yet it's rare. That's you know, a little hubris, lessening hubris for the current president of Israel, as well as for any aspiring author. But when we speak of these assumptions, well, the first and most important assumption was that Israel was going to trade land for peace. Some of us were skeptical, but you know, still to most that sounded like a good idea. But of course, Israel didn't trade land for peace. It didn't even trade land for the false promise. It traded land for terror, which is what happened, especially in Gaza. And as we know, and as Mr. Danon said, that's what would happen if what is now, for all intents and purposes, the independent Palestinian state in Gaza is extended to the West Bank and Judea and Samaria. Also the assumption was that the Palestinians wanted peace in the same way that Israel hungered for peace. That it was willing to give up its territorial demands to live with a half a loaf, or even more than half a loaf, as they were offered 3 times in 2000, 2001, and 2008. And yet each time peace was rejected. And these assumptions that the Palestinians wanted what Israel wanted what Israel's supporters wanted, these were completely unfounded. That's a lesson that people refuse to listen to. It's a lesson that people don't want to learn. Why? Because, well, as we often say in journalism, people believe what they want to believe. People believe what makes the world make sense to them, rather than the hard truth. And that's a difficult thing, but it's a truth, but it's a situation which we have to live with. The cost of all this, partly it's the disillusionment, it's the lack of the sapping of the morale. I keep going back to, for me, what was the seminal moment, certainly in my, covering this issue, and it was about 13 years ago, and it was shortly after, it was in just about September or early October of the year 2000. This was a couple of months after the Camp David summit, not far from here, when Ehud Barak made the offer of a Palestinian state to Yasser Arafat, with Bill Clinton already writing his Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech, about which he is still angry. I interviewed a couple of months after that, and this was just weeks after the second Intifada started, Arafat's complete answer to the offer of peace, a war of terrorist attrition. And I had the opportunity to meet with Shlomo Ben-Ami, who was Ehud Barak's foreign minister, an academic, a very smart man. And he had been very confident, and they had bet their political lives on this gambit of making peace. and had seen it blow up in their faces, and even then they didn't know how bad it was going to be. But he still had that look that I could only describe as sort of like one of those baby seals before those hunters get them. He had been, he was clubbed over the head. And as much as you might disagree with him, you had to sympathize. He truly believed that not only that Oslo would work, but that the follow-up, the ultimate follow-up to Oslo would work, and it had not. And he said to me, almost like, even though he's an academic, he said a very politician-like thing. He says, but there's a silver lining to this. Truly, he said there's a silver lining. He said, the world has now seen who wants peace and who doesn't want peace. Never again, he said that, never again could the world blame Israel for being the fomenter of violence, to being the intransigent. Well, you don't know whether to laugh or to cry in remembering that, because if there's anything that's true, the opposite. And that's true for the entire Oslo process. The other real cost, it's not just the terror, as grievous as that it's been, as Ambassador Ettinger described it, what Israel has suffered from this. It's the delegitimization of a process in which Israel put itself in the place of being a thief returning stolen property. That's what it boils down. That's why these arguments always run into dead ends. That's why so many people in the press and even here in Washington are always saying, when Israeli leaders stand up for themselves, which they don't always do. Not every Israeli diplomat is as forthright as Ambassador Ettinger. And all of us who work in the press and who deal with this issue know that a lot of people in the Israeli Foreign Ministry have always sought to downplay the idea that this is a dispute between two parties with rights. Israelis tend often only to speak of security, while the Palestinians speak of rights. Well, in any court of law, when you talk, the person who's afraid versus the person who has rights, the person who has rights tends to win, and that's part of what's happened here. So a big cost of the Oslo process has been the delegitimization of Israel. And I think all of us understand, if we stop and take ourselves out of the moment, that 20 years ago, we were not having to defend Zionism in the way that we have to defend it now. There was no talk of a one-state solution, at least not outside of Ramallah or Gaza, as there is now on the front pages of the New York Times Week in Review section, as we saw just a couple of weeks ago. The worm is turned in that respect, and Israel has lost for it. That's a big part of the cost. The lessons, summing them up really quickly, and we'll get into it more, I'm sure, later. First, what Israel gives back, it's not going to get back. What Israel gives up, it's never coming back. The Oslo process, we can speak till we're blue in the faces about what a failure it has been, and few can honestly gainsay us. But that doesn't mean that the Palestinian Authority is going away. It doesn't even mean Hamasistan is going away, because the international community would not permit Israel to get away with just going back into Gaza and reversing the colossal disaster of 2005 when Israel again tried to trade land for peace. That isn't going to happen. Israel, yes, Israel is its embodiment. Zionism is about the Jews taking history into their own hands rather than being merely acted upon by others. But Israel lives in an international system, and it cannot, as much as we would like it to be so, it cannot simply wish those things away. Secondly, another temptation, let's also understand that Oslo was a disaster of Israel's own making. The fellow who wrote that book there that can be purchased for one thin penny was the author of it, and his people. Bill Clinton didn't create Oslo. Israel created Oslo. The decisions about war and peace, we often, especially we American Jews, who tend to focus only on our own leaders and our own politics as it plays out upon Israel, we have to understand that these decisions are always going to be made in Israel. And if Israel wants to take a leap into the dark, it's going to do it whether we like it or not, or even whether the United States likes it or not. And as many people have pointed out, most of the big peace initiatives that Israel has undertaken have been manufactured in Jerusalem, not here in Washington. So we have to get that straight. But just as important, and it's important for us as American Jews to understand as well, that Israel doesn't always have to say yes when it is called upon to make sacrifices for peace, as if it hasn't been making sacrifices for peace its entire existence. Israel can say no. That's the beauty of it. And one of the reasons why it can say no are the people in this room, are the people in this town. What we've seen in the last 5 years of the Barack Obama presidency is that we've had a president who, as someone who served on a panel with Daniel Pipes and me, Aaron David Miller said, who's not exactly in love with Israel. And he's a supporter of President Obama. He hasn't exactly been in love with Israel, and indeed he started out his presidency determined to reverse much of the close alliance that had marked his predecessor, to pressure Israel. And yet even during the course of this presidency, we have learned, or at least maybe he's learned, I don't know if we've learned, that there are limits to what an American president, even an American president who's not that in love with Israel, can do to the U.S.-Israel alliance. That's the work of Congress, that's the work of the American public that supports Israel, that has support for Zionism embedded deep in the DNA of our political history. We can help Israel to say no. Now, there are limits to what Israel can do. I would have loved if Deputy Minister Danon had been here, I would have liked to have asked him about how Israel can get around its, proclaimed desire that it can act on its own on Iran while the United States is talking to Iran. I don't personally think Israel can do that. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Ambassador Edinger would like to dispute that. I don't think Israel can attack a country that the United States is involved in a diplomatic process with. But Israel can say no to John Kerry. It can say no to Barack Obama when it comes to creating another Hamasistan. We give it the power to do so, and Israel's sovereignty does. So there are limits. Israel can learn those lessons. The question is, will they? Well, that's the part of the story we don't know yet. But our part of the story as American Jews, as supporters, as Americans who support Israel, whether we're Jewish, Christian, or not, we can empower Israel in a way that gives it the strength to defend its own sovereignty. The question is, will it take advantage? Thank you.
I too would like to thank Sarah and her staff for putting this together, despite all the impediments. Now, there are many experts in this audience who could speak on this subject as knowledgeably as we. I see Maury Hamatai here in the first table.